There's a man whose name strikes fear into the hearts of the entire city. And there's a woman, the only one in that room, who doesn't tremble out of fear of him. She trembles because he called her beautiful. Just that one word. And it shattered her completely. Why can a compliment be more terrifying than a threat? The answer will keep you glued to the screen. Hit like now and comment the city you're watching. I want to know how far this story has progressed. Stay tuned. The ballroom at the Alderton Grand Hotel had a way of making people feel small. That was by design. The ceilings climbed 40 feet above the marble floors, the chandeliers alone cost more than most people earned in a decade, and the light they threw down was the kind of gold that made everything look expensive and everyone look like they were auditioning for a life they hadn't yet earned. Politicians moved through the space with the practiced ease of men who had learned long ago that the secret to power was looking like you'd always had it. Socialites laughed at the right moments. Businessmen shook hands that meant nothing and everything simultaneously. And somewhere beneath all of it, beneath the string quartet and the champagne flutes and the careful orchestration of wealth performing itself, there was the low, constant hum of collective fear. Because Dante Varelli was in the room. He sat at the center table the way a stone sits at the bottom of a river, perfectly still, completely immovable, and somehow responsible for the way everything else moved around it. He was 41 years old and looked it in the way that made 41 seem like a thing to be reckoned with rather than apologized for. The dark suit was cut precisely. The jaw was a hard line. His hands rested flat on the white tablecloth, relaxed, which was the most frightening thing about him, because men who were relaxed in rooms full of nervous people were men who had stopped needing to perform danger. They had become it. The guests stole glances. They always did. And they always looked away fast, the way you look away from a scar. Quickly enough that no one could accuse you of staring, slowly enough that the image stayed with you anyway. Nobody approached his table unless they were invited. That was understood. Serena Vale was not thinking about Dante Varelli. She was thinking about the centerpiece on table 9, which was 3 inches lower than it was supposed to be, and the fact that the catering supervisor, a barrel-chested man named Marcus who sweated through every shirt he owned, had decided tonight was the perfect night to disappear into the kitchen and not come back. She was thinking about the champagne inventory, which was running low 40 minutes ahead of schedule, and the callback she still hadn't gotten from the florist about tomorrow's setup, and the way her left heel had developed a raw spot somewhere around the hour mark that was now making every step feel like a negotiation between professionalism and genuine agony. She was 28 years old, and she had been coordinating events at this level for 3 years, and she was good at it, genuinely good, the kind of good that came not from natural confidence, but from the particular precision of someone who had learned early that the cost of mistakes was very high. She moved through a room by scanning it. She spoke to vendors with a quiet authority that surprised people who expected someone louder, someone bigger. She kept her hair pulled back because loose hair felt like a liability. She wore charcoal and navy and the occasional dark green because colors that didn't demand attention were colors that let her do her job. She was invisible by craft. She had made herself that way. She was moving from the service corridor toward the east end of the ballroom with a replacement floral arrangement balanced in both arms. Not her job, technically, but Marcus was still gone and the gap on table 7 was becoming a problem when the heel caught the edge of the runner carpet. It was a small thing. A half-inch ridge, worn at the corner, the kind of hazard she would have flagged in the pre-event walkthrough if she'd had time to do one. Her weight shifted wrong. Her left arm overcorrected, and the champagne flute that had been sitting at the corner of the nearest table, Dante Varelli's table, went sideways and came apart on the marble floor in a sound that was, in the specific acoustic architecture of that ballroom, almost comically loud. The string quartet didn't stop playing, but the guests nearest to the table did stop talking. The silence moved outward in a slow wave. Serena straightened. The floral arrangement was still in her arms, which felt like a minor victory against the collapse of everything else. She looked down at the broken glass, at the pale splash of champagne across the white tablecloth edge, and she felt the specific, familiar drop in her stomach that came not from embarrassment, but from exposure. Being seen doing something wrong. Being the sudden center of something she hadn't controlled. She looked up. Dante Varelli was watching her. Not the glass, not the tablecloth. Her. She couldn't read his expression. It was too still for that. The face of a man who had trained himself out of legible reactions. But his eyes were direct and dark, and completely present in a way that felt different from the ambient social theater happening everywhere else in the room. He wasn't performing his reaction for the benefit of the people watching him watch her. He was just looking at her. She opened her mouth. "I'm so sorry. I'll have this cleared immediately. I can..." Easy. One word, quiet. Not loud enough for the whole room, just for her. The voice was low and carried a texture like gravel underwater, rough beneath the surface, smoother than it had any right to be at the top. He lifted one hand slightly from the table. Not a wave, not a dismissal, just a small movement that somehow meant stop without needing to say it. There was a faint shift at the corners of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Something adjacent to one. A woman that beautiful shouldn't look so terrified. The guests closest to the table heard it. A low ripple of laughter moved through them. The careful, social laughter of people who were relieved the moment had diffused, who were laughing in part to signal to Dante that they appreciated his restraint, who were laughing because that was what you did when the most dangerous man in the room made a joke. Serena did not laugh. The color left her face the way water drains, sudden, complete, leaving something dry and pale behind. Her hands tightened on the floral arrangement until her knuckles went white. She took one step back, then another. And the movement wasn't graceful. It was wrong. It was the movement of someone whose body had received a signal that their mind hadn't processed yet, the kind of physical recoil that bypassed thought entirely and came from somewhere older and more absolute. The laughter faded. Someone near the table said something quietly, and the conversation resumed, filling the silence with the practiced efficiency of people who knew how to not witness things. The quartet played on. Glasses clinked. The event continued, being an event. But Dante Varelli had stopped looking at the room. He was still looking at her. She set the floral arrangement down on the nearest surface. Not table 7, not where it was supposed to go, just down, just somewhere, and walked toward the service corridor with her eyes on the floor and her hands pressed flat against her thighs. Moving away. Getting out of his line of sight, getting small again. He watched her go. And something in his chest, a place that had been quiet for a long time, that he had made quiet through the specific discipline of not caring about things he couldn't categorize, moved, slightly, like something waking up that hadn't intended to. He reached for his drink. He didn't taste it. Mom. The thing about Dante Varelli was that he had not built his empire on violence alone. That was what people believed. Civilians, law enforcement, the journalists who wrote carefully worded profiles that stopped just short of saying what they actually meant. They saw the violence because the violence was visible. What they didn't see, because he had specifically designed it to be invisible, was the patience. Dante had an almost pathological capacity for fixation. He would notice a thing, and then he would think about it, and then he would take it apart until he understood it completely. It was why he was still alive when so many men who had started with more than him were not. He noticed the way people moved when they were afraid of him. He had been noticing it since he was 19 years old, and by now it was almost boring. The slight duck of the head, the careful distance, the studied nonchalance that fooled no one. Fear had a particular grammar, and he knew all its conjugations. What he had not seen before, not in 22 years of making people afraid, was someone react to a compliment the way Serena Vale had reacted to one. He turned it over in his mind through the rest of the dinner. He watched the event coordinator move through the room. She was back within 10 minutes, collected, composed, doing her job with the quiet efficiency he'd noticed earlier. And he cataloged the things that were wrong. The way she positioned herself with her back toward walls when possible. The way her eyes swept entrances before she stepped through them. The way she physically contracted when anyone moved too quickly in her direction, shoulders rolling slightly inward before she caught herself and straightened. These were not the behaviors of someone who was simply shy. He knew shy. Shy was a social posture. This was something structural, something built into her at a level below decision-making. He didn't ask anyone about her that night. He didn't need to. He had people for that, and by tomorrow he would know her name, her employment history, her address, and the names of anyone connected to her who might be relevant. He knew that this made him a certain kind of man. He had made peace with being that kind of man a long time ago. The drive home from the Alderton took 20 minutes. Dante sat in the back of the car without speaking, which his driver, Caruso, understood meant not to speak either. The city moved past the windows, the lit towers, the bridges, the river reflecting everything back in broken pieces, and Dante watched it with the distant attention of someone whose mind was elsewhere. A woman that beautiful shouldn't look so terrified. He said it the same way he said most things, without fully calculating the effect, simply reading the room and responding to what would diffuse the moment cleanest. It had been a reflexive social tool, not a declaration. He hadn't said it to unsettle her, but it had, not in the way compliments sometimes unsettled women. The flush, the small, pleased uncertainty, the performance of modesty. What he had watched happen to her face was something different, something more serious. The color draining out, the hands going tight. The 2 steps backward with the body's own urgent logic. It was the reaction of someone who had learned, very specifically, that being called beautiful meant something bad was coming. He leaned his head back against the seat. In 22 years, he had done things that kept lawyers employed and federal investigators employed and the occasional priest employed. He had made decisions that he categorized, cleanly and without sentiment, as necessary. He was not a man who revisited those decisions with regret, because regret was a luxury he had trained himself not to afford. But the image of her face, white and stricken and folding inward like a piece of paper catching flame, sat in him like a splinter. Small, precise, irritating in a way he couldn't locate or remove. He told himself it was curiosity. He was good at curiosity. Curiosity was a tool. He told himself that until he almost believed it. The report came back in 18 hours. Her name was Serena Vale, 28 years old, born in Hartford, Connecticut. Mother, Claire Vale, née Harmon, had died of an aneurysm when Serena was 11. Father unknown. She had been raised subsequently by her mother's second husband, one Gerald Knox, a real estate developer and philanthropist of considerable social standing in Connecticut and the surrounding New England business community. Knox had been a trustee on 3 nonprofit boards. He had an endowed scholarship at his name at a private university. He appeared twice in the Hartford Courant's annual 40 Under 40 list from 15 years ago, and once in Forbes's Connecticut Business Supplement. He was, by every public-facing metric, a respected man. Serena had left Hartford at 18, college in Ohio on academic scholarship, minimal contact with Knox thereafter. She had been working in event coordination in New York for 3 years, first at a mid-size firm, then independently, picking up contracts at venues including the Alderton and 2 other comparable hotels. She had no criminal record. She had no social media presence to speak of, a bare professional profile, nothing personal. She had one close friend, a woman named Delia Park, a graphic designer in Brooklyn. No romantic history that his investigator could locate. No relationships of any documented duration. He read the report twice, then he set it down and looked at the window for a long time. Gerald Knox. He didn't know the name, but he knew the type. He had grown up around men like Knox, men whose violence was domestic and deniable, who moved through the world armored in respectability, who were never louder than a closed door. He had watched what those men made of the people who lived inside their reach. He knew the shape of the damage. He knew it because his mother had lived inside that reach once, before he'd become someone who could make that impossible. He picked up his phone. "Find out everything there is to know about Gerald Knox," he said. "Business, personal, financial, everything." A pause on the other end. "How deep?" his man Reyes asked. "All the way," Dante said. He didn't approach her again immediately. He wasn't impulsive. That was another thing people misunderstood about him. He moved slowly, deliberately, the way a tide moves. You didn't notice it until you were already submerged. He arranged another booking at the Alderton for a private dinner 3 weeks later, a legitimate business occasion, the kind he had monthly, and requested the same event coordinator through the hotel's management. He watched how they passed the request to her. He watched her receive it. From across the lobby, through the glass partition of the conference room, he could see the small hesitation before she nodded. She knew the name. Of course she did. The dinner itself was a contained, professional affair. 8 guests, impeccable service, Serena moving around the periphery with the quiet competence he'd already cataloged. He didn't single her out. He didn't look at her longer than necessary. He let the evening proceed on its own terms, and afterward, when she was overseeing the breakdown of the setup, he stopped near the door and said simply and without ceremony, "Good work tonight." She went still. Not all the way still. She caught herself faster this time, the recovery quicker than at the Alderton. But it was there, the flicker of something that wasn't professional pride at a compliment from a client, something older and more defensive. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was even, controlled. He nodded and left. In the car, he sat with his hands loose in his lap and thought about the look on her face. And he thought about Gerald Knox's financial records, which Reyes had begun compiling. And he thought about the particular species of man who could make an 11-year-old girl afraid of kindness. His jaw was tight. He noticed it. He didn't relax it. Over the following 2 weeks, the Knox file thickened. The public picture was immaculate. The philanthropy, the board seats, the charitable donations logged with the careful precision of a man who understood that reputation was infrastructure. But infrastructure, Dante had learned, was most interesting when you looked at what it was built to protect. Reyes had contacts in Connecticut financial circles, and those contacts had contacts in the state tax authority. And what came back through those channels was interesting enough that Dante called Reyes directly instead of waiting for a written summary. "He's been moving money," Reyes said. "Not visibly. Slowly. Out of a family trust that was originally established by the Vale side, Serena's mother's family, going back 2 generations. Knox became co-trustee when he married the mother. He's had sole trustee status since the mother died. And the beneficiary? Sole beneficiary is Serena Vale, at age 28. Dante set down his glass. "She just turned 28, he said. 2 months ago," Reyes confirmed. The silence on the line was the kind that meant something was being processed. "The money," Dante said. "How much? What's left, or what was supposed to be there?" "Both," Reyes told him. The difference between the 2 numbers was large enough that Dante felt it as something physical, a cold pressure in the chest, the particular anger of a man who understood financial violence because he had employed it himself and knew precisely what it was designed to accomplish. It was designed to leave someone with nothing. It was designed to make freedom impossible. Knox had been draining that trust for years, quietly, incrementally. And now that Serena had reached the age at which the remaining funds were supposed to transfer to her control, something was going to happen. Knox wasn't the kind of man who simply gave back what he'd taken. "Is she aware?" Dante asked. "No indication," Reyes said. "She hasn't retained legal counsel. No communications we can find with any fiduciary parties." Dante looked at the window. He thought about her face in the ballroom, the way the color had left it. He thought about a girl who grew up in a house where being beautiful was a warning sign. He thought about a man who had spent 17 years positioning himself as the legal architect of her inheritance while she fled to Ohio and built a quiet life and tried, apparently, to forget that Gerald Knox existed. "Keep watching Knox," he said. "I want to know the moment anything moves." He hung up. For a long moment he sat in the stillness of his office, the city humming 40 floors below, the river a dark line in the middle distance, the evening coming on with the slow indifference of evenings everywhere. And he held the thing he was feeling up to the light of his own self-awareness and looked at it clearly. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. He wasn't going to pretend that it was. The question was what he was going to do about it, and whether Serena Vale was going to get the chance to make her own choices before Gerald Knox made them for her. That question answered itself 11 days later when Reyes called at 6 a.m. with 3 words that made Dante's hand tighten on the phone until the case creaked. "She's gone missing." The call came at 6:14 in the morning and Dante was already awake. He hadn't slept well. Hadn't slept well in 11 days, if he was being precise about it, which he generally was. And he was standing at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand when the phone buzzed on the counter behind him. He knew it was Reyes before he picked it up. Reyes was the only person in his organization who called before 7 because Reyes understood that the hours before the city fully woke were the hours when problems became emergencies, and emergencies became something worse. He picked up. "She's gone missing." 3 words. Dante didn't respond immediately. He turned them over the way you turn a stone, looking for what lived underneath. "Since when?" he said. Not a question. A demand for specifics. Last confirmed sighting was 2 days ago. She had a booking at the Morrison event space. Private birthday party, routine work. She finished the setup, oversaw the first hour of the event, and then left. Standard for her. Coordinators don't always stay the full duration. Reyes paused. The pause meant there was something that didn't fit, and he was deciding how to say it. Her contact, Delia Park, tried to reach her the following morning. No answer. She went to the apartment yesterday afternoon. Building Super let her in because she said it was an emergency. Apartment was locked from the inside with the chain, personal items still there, phone on the kitchen counter. She left her phone. Yes. Dante set down the coffee. He moved to the couch and sat and put both elbows on his knees and looked at the floor between his feet. The floor was dark wood, expensive, completely meaningless. "Knox," he said. "That's my read," Reyes said. "The trust transfer date is in 3 weeks. He's been moving slower than I expected, but the pattern, pulling her back before the deadline, before she can get legal counsel involved. Where does Knox have property outside Hartford?" 3 locations. A condo in Boston he rents out. A vacation property in the Berkshires that's been in his family since the 90s. And the original Knox family estate, Dunmore, they call it. Outside Hadley. Rural. About 40 acres. Dante already knew which one. "Dunmore," he said. "It's where she grew up," Reyes confirmed. After the mother died, Knox moved them both out there. She was 11. She left at 18. 7 years. 7 years in a house on 40 acres with no neighbors close enough to hear anything worth hearing. Dante had grown up in South Brooklyn in a building with walls so thin you could hear your neighbors' arguments like they were your own. And even then, there were things that happened behind closed doors that no one heard. He didn't need to imagine what 7 years at Dunmore had looked like. The shape of it was already clear. "I need eyes on Dunmore," he said. "Now. Not tomorrow. I've got Mercer 2 hours out. Send him. And pull Voss and Cabrera off the Trenton situation. I want them on standby." A beat. "Dante." Reyes's voice had shifted. Not deferential, never exactly deferential, but careful in the way of a man who had worked alongside another man for 12 years, and had therefore earned the specific right to say true things. "If she's there and Knox is holding her, that's a federal situation. Kidnapping, financial crimes. I know what it is. I'm saying there are channels." "She grew up in that house," Dante said. His voice was quiet. That was how you knew it wasn't a discussion anymore. She spent 7 years in that house and nobody used any channels. Whatever channels existed didn't find her useful enough to protect. He stood. "Send Mercer." The line went quiet for a moment. "Sending Mercer," Reyes said. Inbound. Delia Park lived in a 3rd-floor walk-up in Carroll Gardens, Brooklyn, above a dry cleaner that didn't open until 10. Dante arrived at 8:15 with a man named Tate, who was large and quiet, and whose presence had a specific social gravity that made most people very willing to answer questions. Dante knocked. The woman who opened the door looked like she hadn't slept. Late 20s, Korean-American, hair pulled back with a pencil still stuck through it, eyes red at the rims with the particular rawness of someone who had been crying intermittently for about 20 hours. She was wearing paint-stained sweatpants and a university sweatshirt, and she had her phone in her hand, which meant she'd been waiting for it to ring. She looked at Dante, then at Tate, then back at Dante. "You're Varelli," she said. He didn't confirm it. He didn't need to. "You know where she is?" Her voice cracked on the last word, and she pulled it back together with visible effort. The grief in her face rearranged itself into something harder. "Or are you part of the reason she's—" "I'm trying to find her," Dante said. "Can I come in?" It wasn't a request, but it also wasn't a threat. He'd calibrated it to land somewhere between the two because Delia Park didn't look like someone who responded well to either. She stepped back from the door. The apartment was small and very much lived in. Plants on every horizontal surface, canvases stacked against one wall, coffee cups that formed a loose archaeological record of the past several days. She'd been working, or trying to. Half-finished illustrations covered the kitchen table. She moved to the counter and stood with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and looked at him the way people looked at things they weren't sure were going to hurt them. "When did you last actually talk to her?" he said. "Not text. Talk." 4 days ago. She called me from the event space during the setup, said she was tired, said she had a headache. Delia's jaw tightened. She sounded... There was something off. I didn't push it. I should have pushed it. What was off? She was quiet in a way she gets sometimes, not depressed quiet, like she was watching something. Delia uncrossed her arms and pressed one hand flat on the counter. She gets like that when something's triggered her, when something's reminded her of before. Before meaning Knox. The name landed in the room like a stone in still water. Delia's eyes went sharp. "She told you about him." "No," Dante said. "I found out." "You found out." The flatness in her voice was its own kind of indictment. "How long have you been... What is this? Why does Dante Varelli know who Gerald Knox is?" "Because I looked," he said. "Because something about her told me I should look." The silence that followed was complicated. He let it be complicated. He'd learned that rushing a silence was how you got lies instead of truth. Delia looked at the table, at the illustrations, at something that wasn't in the room. "He called her," she said finally, "about 2 weeks ago. She told me after. She didn't want to tell me. She downplayed it. But I know her and I could hear what she wasn't saying." She looked back at him. He told her there were documents she needed to sign. Something about the trust, transitioning it properly. Some administrative thing. He said she needed to come up to Dunmore to do it in person. She said she'd handle it through a lawyer. He didn't like that. He never likes that. The words came out with the specific tiredness of someone who had heard this story told in pieces over many years. He called twice more after that. She stopped answering. "I thought she'd handled it. I thought she was okay." Dante looked at her directly. "Did she ever tell you the specifics of what happened at Dunmore? When she was a child?" Delia met his eyes. The look on her face was the look of someone who was deciding what a stranger deserved to know, and arriving at an answer that clearly cost her something. "Not in detail," she said. "She doesn't talk about it in detail, but enough." She pulled in a breath. "Enough that I understand why she left her phone on the counter." Dante went still. "What does that mean?" he said. "It means she knew," Delia said. "If she left her phone, she left it on purpose. She was trying to cut a trail. She didn't want anyone finding her through it." She pressed her lips together. "Which means she had enough warning to think before she disappeared. Which means she wasn't just grabbed." Dante looked at the window. Outside, Carroll Gardens was becoming its morning self. The delivery trucks, the school-age kids, the particular noise of a burro getting to work. "Or she was given a choice that wasn't really a choice," he said quietly. Delia made a sound that was almost a laugh, but wasn't. "Yeah, that's very Gerald Knox, actually. The illusion of choice." Mercer checked in at 9:47. Dante was back in the car, moving north on the BQE, when the call came through. Mercer was compact and methodical and had the specific observational skill set of someone who had spent 8 years doing reconnaissance work that he did not discuss in specifics. He spoke in the low, even cadence of a man who had learned to deliver bad news without inflection. "Vehicle in the East Drive," Mercer said. "Late model silver sedan, Connecticut plates, registered to a holding company tied to Knox's real estate operation. Second vehicle near, older, looked like a service truck, parked around the back, north side. I can see 2 men outside. Position, not working. Security. Knox's people. Not professionals. The way they're standing is wrong. But they have the weight of people who've been told they have permission to do things." A pause. "There's a light on in the second floor, right wing. Curtains drawn, but there's a gap. I can see movement. Female silhouette." Dante's hand tightened on the phone. "Is she moving freely?" "She's sitting. Been sitting since I got a line on the window, about 15 minutes. Not pacing, not moving toward the window. Another pause. The way she's sitting, I've seen it before. It's how people sit when they're waiting for something they're not looking forward to. Knocks inside? I clocked a male figure on the ground floor, moving between the kitchen and what looked like an office. One other male, older, near the front sitting room. Could be staff, could be another layer of security. Mercer's voice remained level. What do you want me to do? Stay on observation. Don't move, don't approach. I need to know if anything shifts. If she moves, if Knox moves, if any vehicles leave. Understood. And Mercer, Dante paused. If it looks like she's being harmed, don't wait for my call. A beat. Understood, Mercer said again, differently. Reyes was waiting at the curb outside Dante's building when the car pulled up. He was a lean man, Reyes, angular in a way that made him look perpetually impatient even when he wasn't. And he had a tablet in his hand and the look of someone who had been awake for a very long time, assembling information that he knew was going to land badly. Tell me, Dante said, moving past him toward the elevator. Knox filed a motion in Connecticut probate court 6 days ago. Reyes kept pace. Emergency conservatorship. He's claiming Serena is mentally incapacitated, unable to manage her own affairs. He's attached a psychiatric evaluation from a doctor in West Hartford who, coincidentally, has been on retainer to one of Knox's companies for 11 years. The elevator opened. They got in. He's trying to take permanent control of the trust, Dante said. Not just the trust. If he gets conservatorship, he controls all her finances, her medical decisions, her legal representation. She can't sign a contract, can't retain her own lawyer, can't challenge anything he does without his permission. Reyes swiped to the next document on the tablet. The hearing is in 10 days. Without her appearing in person, without her contesting it, the motion will likely be granted by default. The elevator opened on the 40th floor. Dante walked to his office, to the window, to the view he'd stood at 6 hours ago when the city was still dark. It was fully daylight now. The river was silver. Everything looked clean from up here, which was one of the many lies that Haidt told. He's kept her off the grid so she can't be reached before the hearing, Dante said. That's my read. He doesn't need her to sign anything. He just needs her inaccessible for 10 days. Reyes set the tablet on the desk. Dante, there's a legal process here. If we move on that property, if we go in there, he's going to take everything she has, Dante said. He wasn't looking at Reyes. He was looking at the river. Everything her mother's family built. Everything that was supposed to be hers. And she's sitting in a room in that house right now waiting for whatever comes next. Reyes was quiet. You know what she grew up in, Dante said. You've seen the file. I've seen the file. Then you know that house is not a place where she goes willingly, which means she was maneuvered into it, which means she walked in there already knowing she had no good options. He turned from the window. I'm not leaving her in that house for 10 days. Reyes held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once. The nod of a man who had made the calculation and knew the answer regardless of whether he'd been asked. Voss and Cabrera are 90 minutes out, he said. What do you want them to carry? At 2 in the afternoon, Dante's phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He answered it on the second ring. The connection was thin, patchy, the quality of a call made from a device with poor signal. A landline, maybe, or a prepaid phone with minimal bars. When she spoke, her voice was very controlled. So controlled it sounded like something assembled rather than natural, like someone had taken a voice apart and put it back together one piece at a time and was now operating it manually. Mr. Varelli, a pause. I know you've been asking questions about me, about my family. The word family came out slightly wrong, like it had an aftertaste she couldn't quite hide. I need you to stop. Dante sat very still. Serena, he said. The silence that followed was the length of 2 heartbeats. He knows, she said. Lower now, the control slipping fractionally. He knows someone's been looking at the trust records. He thinks he's going to... She stopped. He could hear her breathing. He could hear her deciding what to say and what not to say with the specific carefulness of someone who knew they might be overheard. I need you to leave this alone. I need you to not make this worse. Where are you? It doesn't matter. Serena, where are you? It matters more that you stop. Her voice had gone tight in a way that was trying to sound decisive, and instead sounded like someone pressing their thumb against a wound. He's going to hurt people. He'll use you as a reason to do something that can't be undone, and it'll be my fault. Do you understand? It'll be my fault because She cut herself off, because she'd reached out to him. Not directly, not intentionally, but she'd been present in his orbit and he'd started pulling threads, and now Knox knew the threads had been pulled. That's not how fault works, Dante said. You don't know how he works. I know exactly how he works. He kept his voice even, flat, stripped of everything that might sound like performance. I've read your financial records. I know what he's done to the trust. I know about the conservatorship motion. He paused. I know you grew up in that house. The silence this time was longer. When she spoke again, the control in her voice had changed quality. Not gone, but different, thinner, like something stretched very close to its limit. You need to stay out of this, she said. Please. I'm not going to do that. Mr. Varelli, Dante, please. Just the one word. And underneath it, underneath the control and the careful management and the assembled voice, there was something that sounded like someone who had been exhausted for a very long time and was not entirely sure how much further they could carry it. He felt it like a hand closing around something in his chest. I'm coming, he said quietly, whether you want me to or not. And when I get there, you can tell me to leave to my face and I'll consider it. But I'm not leaving you in that house for 10 days while Knox builds a legal cage around you and calls it protection. He paused. Are you hurt? A beat. Not yet, she said. The line went dead. Dante sat with the phone in his hand for 3 seconds. Then he stood, picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, and walked to the door. Reyes, he said, stepping into the corridor. Reyes was already standing, already had his phone out, already had the look of a man who had heard enough through the thin walls of the hallway to know what was being asked of him. Cars are downstairs, he said. We leave in 10. Dante nodded. Outside the window behind him, the city went on being the city, indifferent and enormous and lit with the particular gold of a late afternoon that didn't know or care what was building inside one rural property 2 hours to the north. The river moved. The bridges held. The towers kept their distance. And somewhere in a room on the second floor of a house called Dunmore, a woman put down a phone she'd borrowed from a house employee who didn't know what was at stake and pressed her back against the wall and listened to the footsteps coming up the stairs toward her door. They were Gerald Knox's footsteps. She recognized them the way you recognize a sound that has been embedded into you at an age before language, not with the mind but with the body, the specific cold that moved up the back of her neck, the way her lungs did something wrong for a moment before she made herself breathe correctly. The footsteps stopped outside the door. A pause. Then his voice, muffled through the wood, smooth and domestic and absolutely certain of itself. Serena, we need to talk about tomorrow. She looked at the door. Her hands were flat at her sides, still, deliberate. She had made a call she should not have made to a man she did not fully understand, and that man was now 2 hours away and closing the distance. And Gerald Knox was on the other side of a locked door that he had a key to. And outside the window, the sun was going down over 40 acres of property that had belonged to his family for 3 generations, and there was not a single person within earshot who was on her side. The door handle moved. She did not step back. That was new. That, she realized in the fraction of a second before the door opened, was the first new thing she had done in a very long time. She had spent years stepping back. From rooms, from people, from anything that moved toward her too fast. She had made an art form of retreat, but she had made a phone call. And she was still standing where she'd been standing when the footsteps started. The door opened. Gerald Knox stepped into the room and looked at her, and his face did the thing it always did, the careful arrangement of concern over something much colder. And he said, "You look pale, sweetheart. You should eat something." Serena looked at the man who had stolen her childhood and 17 years of her inheritance and her capacity to believe that a compliment was just a compliment, and she said nothing at all. Because Dante Varelli was 2 hours away. And for the first time in her life, 2 hours felt like something she could survive. Gerald Knox had a way of filling a room that had nothing to do with his size. He was not a large man, medium height, medium build, the kind of physical presence that photographs well but doesn't dominate a space naturally. What dominated was the thing he carried with him, the invisible architecture of absolute certainty that what he wanted would be arranged around him the way furniture arranged itself around the person who owned the house. He was 63 years old and had spent 40 of those years being someone that other people reorganized themselves to accommodate, and it had left a mark on him that was more structural than cosmetic. The posture, the pace of his movements, unhurried, precise. The movements of a man who had never needed to rush because the world had consistently waited for him. The way his eyes moved across a room before they settled on a person, cataloging the space before acknowledging the human in it. He stood in the doorway of the second-floor room and looked at Serena the way he always looked at her, with the patient, proprietary attention of someone examining something they owned that had recently been misbehaving. "You look pale, sweetheart. You should eat something." Serena said nothing. Knox stepped into the room. He moved to the chair near the window, the armchair, the good one, the one that faced the door, and sat in it with the ease of a man settling into a space that had always been his. He crossed one leg over the other. He folded his hands in his lap. The concern on his face was a masterwork. 20 years of refinement, the slightly furrowed brow, the patient eyes, the set of the mouth that communicated worry without alarm. It was the face he showed to his board colleagues when a project was underperforming. It was the face he had shown to Serena's teachers when they called about her absences, her silence, the way she sometimes fell asleep in class. "I heard you on the phone earlier," he said. Serena's hand stayed flat at her sides. "The Parveen woman let you use her cell," he continued conversationally, as if he were narrating something mildly interesting. "I've spoken to her about that. She understands now that it was inappropriate." A pause. "Who did you call, Serena?" "A friend?" she said. "A friend?" He repeated it with the gentle skepticism of a man who found the claim technically possible but narratively unconvincing. "You don't have many of those. Delia Park, and she's in Brooklyn, so—" He tilted his head slightly. "Was it someone I know?" She looked at him. Not through him, not around him, at him, directly. That was the new thing, the thing she'd noticed in the second before he opened the door. She was looking at him. "No," she said. Something moved behind his eyes, quick, gone. "Serena?" He uncrossed his legs, leaned forward slightly, just slightly, the body language of intimacy, of concern getting closer to make itself heard. "I need you to understand something. The documents we need to sort out, the trust transfer, the transition of management, this is for you. I've spent 17 years managing those assets. I've grown them. I've protected them. And now there are some complicated administrative processes we have to work through together, as a family, before we can move the principal into your name cleanly." His voice was warm, even, textbook reasonable. "I'm not the enemy here." "I know what you've taken," she said. The warmth in his face did not disappear. It just became something else underneath, the way water becomes ice, the surface looking the same for a moment before the temperature made itself obvious. "Excuse me. From the trust." She held his gaze. Her heart was hitting her ribs hard enough that she could feel it in her throat, but her voice was level, and she kept it level the way she'd kept things level for 3 years in New York, by making herself smaller than the thing she was afraid of and working around it from the edges. She was done working around it. "I know what the numbers were supposed to be. I know what they are now. I know about the consulting fees and the management expenses and the capital reallocation and whatever else you called it." Knox looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat back in the chair. The concern left his face, not dramatically. There was no sudden coldness, no mask dropping in a single motion. It was more like watching a light source dim slowly from one side. The warmth withdrew by degrees, and what was underneath it was not rage, not cruelty. Those were too animated, too human. What was underneath it was something much more efficient, an absence of performance. The face of a man who had stopped needing to manage his expression because the audience had changed. "Who told you that?" he said. "It doesn't matter. It matters to me. Then you'll have to be disappointed, she said. I'm not signing anything. I'm not going to sign anything. And I'm not going to be here in 10 days when your hearing comes up because I'm going to contest the conservatorship, and I'm going to do it with a lawyer you haven't spent 11 years paying. Knox looked at her. He looked at her for long enough that the silence became its own kind of pressure. The specific pressure of a man deciding which tool to reach for, because there were several tools available and not all of them were verbal. You've been talking to Varelli, he said. The name in his mouth was something different than it was anywhere else. Flat. Precise. Not afraid of it. Knox was not a man who frightened easily, which was one of the things that had always made him dangerous, but aware of it, the way you were aware of weather. Serena said nothing. Serena. He stood, unhurried. I'm going to need you to think very carefully about what you're doing, not for my sake, for yours. He moved to the window, stood with his back to her, looking at the property below, the dark tree line, the drive, the acres that had belonged to his family before she existed and would belong to his estate long after the inconvenience of her was resolved. Dante Varelli is not someone who helps people. He's someone who collects them. Whatever he's told you, whatever he's suggested, he has interests that are not yours. He is using you as an instrument to get at something he wants. And when he's finished with that, you will have traded one problem for something considerably worse. He turned from the window. I am the only person in your life who has consistently been there, he said. I know you don't see it that way. I know there are things that happened when you were young that you've constructed a particular narrative around. But feelings are not facts, sweetheart. And the facts are that you have assets you do not have the experience to manage. And a man you've met twice, who has built his entire life on violence and exploitation, is whispering in your ear that he's going to save you. He walked toward the door, paused with his hand on the frame. Get some sleep, he said. We'll talk more in the morning when you're thinking more clearly. He left the door open behind him. She stood in the room and breathed. Thump. The convoy left New York at 4:15. 3 vehicles, Dante's car in the middle, Voss and Cabrera ahead in a dark SUV, a third car behind with 2 more men Reyes had pulled from their regular assignments. It was not a subtle arrangement. Dante was aware of that and had decided to be aware of it rather than concerned by it. Subtlety was a tool for situations where time was available. Time was not currently available. Reyes rode with Dante. He spent the first 40 minutes on his phone, making calls in a low and efficient voice that Dante didn't listen to because Reyes's logistics were Reyes's domain, and that was precisely why Reyes was Reyes. Dante looked out the window at the highway becoming suburbs, becoming the kind of semi-rural corridor that existed between cities like a long exhalation. The gas stations, the outlet malls, the stretches of bare interstate where the sky opened up and got very large. He was thinking about the call. Not yet. 2 words. The most honest thing she'd said to him in either of their 2 brief conversations, which was probably because she hadn't intended to say it. It had come out under pressure, the truth surfacing the way it always did when the performance cost too much to maintain. Not yet meant there was a timeline. Not yet meant Knox hadn't heard her yet, but was going to, and she knew it, and she was sitting in that room counting something, hours, nerve, the distance between now and when that changed. He thought about what Delia Park had said, the illusion of choice. His phone buzzed. Mercer. Movement, Mercer said. Second vehicle just left the property, the service truck, north side. 2 men, heading east. Not toward the main road, toward the back access. Perimeter check or evacuation prep? My read is prep. They were carrying something. Equipment bags. Dante straightened in his seat. Knox knows someone's coming. Looks that way. He glanced at Reyes, who had already ended his own call and was listening. He's going to move her, Dante said. Reyes nodded once. How far out are we? 70 minutes, Caruso said from the front. Mercer, stay on the house. If Knox moves to transfer her to a vehicle, I need to know immediately. Understood. He hung up. Looked at the road ahead. 70 minutes was 70 minutes, and there was no way to make it less, which was a specific, grinding kind of helplessness that he was not practiced at and did not like. Reyes said, There's something else. Dante looked at him. Reyes turned the tablet. On the screen was a document, a legal filing, dense with the specific language of people who were paid by the word. This came through 30 minutes ago. Connecticut probate. Knox's attorney filed an amendment to the conservatorship motion this afternoon. What amendment? He's added a provision. If the motion is granted, Serena would be required to take up residence at an approved facility for the duration of the conservatorship period. Reyes paused. The approved facility is a private psychiatric residence in Vermont, owned by a company that 3 levels of holding structure deep connects back to a Knox family trust. Dante looked at the document. He was never going to let her walk out of Dunmore, he said. It wasn't a question. It was the sound of a picture completing itself. No, Reyes said. The isolation, the hearing, the conservatorship, it was always building to this. Once she's in that facility, she can't contact anyone without his approval, can't retain legal counsel, can't contest anything. He swiped to another document, and the trust assets would have been completely liquidated within the first 6 months. Legitimate management fees under conservatorship, fully legal. Dante set down the tablet. Outside, the highway was getting quieter. The city was truly behind them now. Ahead, the sky was going dark at the edges, the blue thinning out at the horizon, the first suggestion of evening coming on from the east. He thought about a girl of 11, newly motherless, moved to a house on 40 acres with a man who had already begun constructing the legal architecture of her eventual erasure. He thought about 7 years of that. He thought about what it cost to survive 7 years of that and still be functional, still be good at something, still be capable of building a life in New York with plants on every surface and one good friend and a professional reputation that people paid for. The anger in him was not hot. That was the thing about the way he was built. The anger ran cold and deep and very, very permanent. Reyes, he said. Yeah. When we get there, Knox's men. What's our read? Mercer counted 4 total, 2 confirmed carrying. Not professionals, but not civilians either. Private security, probably contracted through one of Knox's companies. They'll have instructions, but they won't have loyalty. Men like that fold when the math changes. Dante nodded. And Knox himself. Reyes was quiet for a moment. Knox is going to try to make this legal. Whatever happens at that house, he's going to frame it as trespassing, as criminal intimidation. He'll have his phone out before we're through the door. He's going to try to make you the story. I know. So how do you want to play it? Dante looked at the road. Let him try, he said. Serena had been in his room for 4 hours when the second knock came. This one wasn't Knox. The rhythm was wrong, too quick, too uncertain, the knock of someone who didn't want to be heard doing it. She crossed the room and opened the door 2 inches. The woman on the other side was Marisol, mid-40s, small, the housekeeper who had worked at Dunmore for 11 years and who, when Serena was a teenager, had occasionally left a sandwich outside her door without being asked. They had never spoken directly about why. They hadn't needed to. Marisol's eyes were moving, not at Serena, at the hallway behind her, at the staircase, at the empty corridor with the specific vigilance of someone who was doing something they were not supposed to be doing. He's on the phone, Marisol said, very low. Downstairs. I heard your name. And the word tonight. She pressed something into Serena's hand. A key. Old brass. The east cellar door. The lock is on the outside. You leave it on the ground. Keep moving to the tree line. She looked at Serena directly for the first time. There's a road past the tree line, a half-mile east. You remember. Serena looked at the key. Marisol. Go, the woman said. Before he finishes the call. She was already backing away, her eyes doing the hallway check again. I should have done more when you were young. I know that. I live with it. Her voice didn't crack. She delivered it like a fact, which was worse somehow than if she'd cried. Go now. That's what I can do now. She was gone before Serena could respond, moving down the back corridor with the efficient silence of someone who had spent 11 years learning how not to be noticed in this house. Serena looked at the key. She closed the door quietly, put her back against it. Thought. The east cellar door. The tree line. A road half a mile east with no phone, no car, no money in her pockets because Knox had quietly and kindly relieved her of her bag on arrival, just for safekeeping, just so nothing gets lost. You know how these old houses are. She looked at the window. It was full dark outside now. The property lights were on. The ones on the drive, the ones on the corners of the house. Pools of yellow in the surrounding black. She could see the edge of the east lawn from here. The tree line was a dark mass beyond it, solid and lightless. Half a mile. She had run on a treadmill 3 times a week for 2 years. She was not particularly fast, but she was consistent, which was a different kind of useful. She put the key in her pocket. She waited. Downstairs, she could hear Knox's voice. Not the words, just the tone, the flat, decisive rhythm of a man giving instructions. She counted 60 seconds, counted them again. Then she moved to the door, opened it, and stepped into the corridor. The east staircase was the servants' staircase, narrow, wooden, the treads worn smooth in the middle by decades of feet that were never supposed to be the main story of this house. She took it carefully, weight on the outside edge of each step where the wood was stiffer and less likely to speak. Down through the dark of the back hall, past the kitchen where she could hear Marisol moving deliberately, creating the sound of ordinary domestic activity like a curtain drawn across a window. The cellar door was where she remembered. Low ceiling, stone walls, the smell of cold and earth, and the particular damp of places that had been sealed for long periods. She moved through this dark by memory. 16 steps to the left, the shelf of old tools, the turn, the door at the end with the light under it from the property lights outside. She found the handle. She pushed. Cold air, grass, the night. She didn't stop. She moved across the east lawn with her head down and her arms close to her body, and she did not look back at the house because looking back was a habit she was done with. The grass was wet from earlier rain, and her shoes soaked through in the first 20 steps, and she kept moving. The tree line was further than she remembered it being. Distances at night, on foot, in fear, were a different unit of measurement entirely. But the darkness of it was consistent, and she kept it in front of her and kept moving. She was 30 feet from the trees when she heard it. Not Knox, not the house. A car engine, somewhere on the road beyond the tree line, getting louder. She stopped. The engine sound multiplied. 2 engines. 3. Moving fast and then slowing. The sound of vehicles decelerating, pulling over, cutting engines to a low idle. Coming from the east. She stood at the edge of the lawn with the tree line 5 steps in front of her, and the house at her back and a road half a mile away that might be Dante Varelli, or might be Gerald Knox's second layer of a plan she hadn't fully mapped. And she understood, in the specific sharp clarity of a moment that demanded an immediate decision, that this was what it had always come down to. Not the documents, not the trust, not the conservatorship hearing 10 days away. This moment, this dark lawn, this choice. She took the 5 steps into the trees, and then the lights went on behind her. Not the property lights. Those were already on. These were new, bright, vehicle lights, flooding the east lawn from the direction of the house, sweeping across the grass in a wide arc. She turned, pressing herself against the nearest trunk, and saw what had happened. Knox had come around the side of the house. He was not alone. 2 men with him, moving fast, the one on the left with a light source in hand, a heavy flashlight, the beam cutting across the lawn in the direction of the tree line. Knox himself was not running. He was walking, which was how she knew it was bad, because Gerald Knox at a walk was more dangerous than anyone else at a run. He had a phone to his ear. He was looking directly at the tree line, and behind her, beyond the trees, in the direction of the road, half a mile east, the engine sounds had stopped. The lights of the vehicles were visible through the trees, and headlights, cutting through the branches, close. Very close, quarter mile, maybe less. She pressed her back against the trunk. Knox's flashlight swept across the trees 20 feet to her left. She didn't breathe. The voice came from behind her, from the direction of the vehicles, from the other side of the tree line, low and carrying with the specific acoustic confidence of someone who knew how to project sound without raising it. Serena. 1 word. She knew the voice. She turned toward it, and Knox's flashlight found her. The beam hit her full in the face, white, blinding, the world behind it going black. and she heard his voice across the lawn, no longer the careful domestic warmth of the room upstairs, no longer the patient concern of a man performing his best self for an audience of one. What she heard was the voice he used when there was no performance necessary, when the door was closed and the house was quiet and there was no one to be reasonable for. "Don't move," he said. She was standing between the two of them, Knox behind her with his light and his two men, Dante somewhere ahead of her in the dark beyond the trees. And the trunk of the tree was at her back, and the ground was wet under her feet, and she had a brass key in her pocket that had already done its job and no longer mattered. She turned away from Knox's light. She walked toward the dark. Behind her, she heard Knox say something sharp to his men, heard the sound of movement on the lawn, heard the beam of the flashlight skittering across the trees as they started after her. And then she was through the last line of trees, and the road was in front of her, gravel and asphalt. And the vehicles were right there, 3 of them, dark, and the figures standing beside them resolved out of the darkness one at a time as her eyes adjusted. Reyes she didn't recognize. Voss and Cabrera she didn't recognize. The man in the center she did. Dante Varelli stood at the edge of the road with his jacket open and his hands at his sides and the particular stillness of someone who had been moving very fast for the past several hours and had just arrived at the place they were moving toward. He looked at her, at the state of her, the wet shoes and the torn knee of her trousers where she'd caught it on something in the cellar, and the expression on her face that was several things at once, none of them simple. He didn't say, "I told you I was coming." He didn't say, "Are you okay?" He didn't reach for her or perform the relief he felt because this wasn't the moment for performance. He said, "How many men does he have with him?" Clear, direct. The question of someone who was already moving to the next problem. She looked at him for 1 second. Just one. "2?" she said. "He's right behind me." He nodded. He looked past her toward the tree line, and then Gerald Knox stepped out of the trees with his flashlight and his 2 men and his phone still in his hand, and he looked at Dante Varelli across 15 feet of gravel road, and the night around all of them went very still. Knox's face did something complicated. The performance came back. She could see it reassembling itself in real time. The concern, the reasonableness, the patient authority of a man who was used to being the one with the most legitimate claim on any given situation. He looked at Dante the way you looked at something you'd been briefed on and found, in person, approximately as manageable as expected. "Mr. Varelli," he said, calm, even. "This is private property. You're trespassing on a family matter, and I have a phone in my hand with the county sheriff's number already dialed." Dante looked at him. "Go ahead," he said. Knox's thumb moved to the screen, and then Reyes said quietly from somewhere to Dante's left, "Before you do that, you might want to know what we filed with the Connecticut Attorney General's office 40 minutes ago." Knox's thumb stopped. Reyes held up the tablet. Even from 15 feet away, in the beam of the flashlight, the document headers were visible. Financial records, trust records. 17 years of carefully obscured transactions laid out with the specific, devastating clarity of people who had spent the past 11 days doing nothing but pulling threads. Fraudulent breach of fiduciary duty, Reyes said. Conservatorship fraud. Financial elder abuse. That's a specific statute in Connecticut, in case your attorney hasn't mentioned it. And the psychiatric evaluation you filed with probate court, the evaluating physician's license was suspended in 2019, which your attorney also definitely knows. He lowered the tablet. The AG's office has a copy. The Hartford Courant's investigative desk has a copy. And the probate court has a motion to stay the hearing filed approximately 20 minutes ago, pending investigation. Knox stood in the beam of his own flashlight. The expression on his face was the most honest thing Serena had ever seen on it, which meant it was terrible. The specific blankness of a man watching the infrastructure of 40 years collapse in the span of 90 seconds. His thumb moved away from the phone screen. Serena stood between them on the gravel road and felt something happening in her chest. Not relief, not yet. It was too early for relief, and she knew too well how quickly things could reverse, but something adjacent. Something that felt like a wall she'd been holding up for a very long time, beginning, just slightly, to take some of its own weight. Knox looked at her. And what she saw in his face, Underneath the blankness, underneath the collapsed performance, was not remorse, was not even anger in the way she'd always known his anger. It was something more fundamental than both. It was the face of a man who had never, in 40 years of moving through the world on his own terms, been stopped. "Serena," he said. She said nothing. "You don't understand what you've—" "I understand perfectly," she said. Her voice was level. Dante looked at her when she said it. She felt him look at her, not checking on her, not assessing her state, something else, something that took a moment to identify. He was watching her. The way you watch something that was becoming what it had always been capable of being. Knox heard it too. The steadiness in her voice, the absence of the thing he had spent 17 years cultivating in her, the flinch, the retreat, the half-step backward that was his preferred proof that he still had control of the room. It wasn't there, and the absence of it did something to his face that she had never seen before. Not rage, not the cold efficiency of a man reaching for his next tool, something closer to uncertainty. It lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then his hand moved, not toward the phone, toward the man on his left. A quick, sharp gesture, the kind of gesture that had a prearranged meaning, the kind you only used when you discussed contingencies in advance. The man on his left was large, younger than Dante by a decade, with the thick-necked patience of someone hired specifically for moments when negotiation became impractical. He moved toward Serena. Dante moved faster, not toward the man, toward Serena. One step, clean and direct, and he was between her and the man coming across the gravel. And the man pulled up short because Dante Varelli at close range had a specific gravitational quality that made people recalculate their immediate plans. The man was 3 inches taller and 40 pounds heavier, and he stopped anyway. Voss didn't stop. Voss came around the left side of Dante's car with the unhurried purposefulness of someone for whom this category of situation was administrative, and the large man looked at Voss and made a decision that was, by any practical assessment, the correct one. He stepped back. The second man, Knox's other security, smaller, older, stationed to Knox's right, looked at Cabrera, who had materialized near the tree line at some point in the preceding 30 seconds with the unobtrusive competence of a man who was very good at not being where people expected him to be until he was exactly where he needed to be. The second man put his hands at his sides, palms out. Universal language. Knox watched all of this happen around him. The redistribution of leverage, the closing of the angles. He had a particular intelligence. Serena had grown up knowing it, the way you knew the weather patterns of the specific geography you lived in. And that intelligence was now processing the reality that the contingency he'd prearranged had failed to materialize the way it was supposed to. He dialed. The county sheriff's number. He'd said it already, and he followed through on things he said, which was one of the ways he maintained the illusion of consistency. Dante let him dial. Reyes made a call of his own. Knox's phone was on speaker. Serena could hear the ring, then the pickup, the flat bureaucratic voice of a late-shift dispatcher. Knox said his name and his address and the word trespassing with the crisp authority of a man who had made this kind of call before and knew that the specific way you spoke to county law enforcement was the specific way you reminded them who kept their funding comfortable. Dante's hand was on Serena's shoulder, not gripping, not pulling her in any direction, just present, the way a wall was present, something solid at the edge of the space she was standing in. She was shaking. She hadn't noticed until the adrenaline of the tree line and the lawn and the decision to walk toward the dark, rather than away from it, had begun, slightly, to metabolize. Her hands were doing something she couldn't fully control, a fine vibration that had nothing to do with cold. She pressed them flat against her thighs. Knox finished the call. He looked at Dante. "They'll be here in 20 minutes, he said. "Good," Dante said. Knox's eyes moved from Dante to Serena and back, reading the geometry of it. "I want you to understand something. Whatever she's told you, whatever she's led you to believe about this family, she hasn't told me anything," Dante said. "You told me. Your financial records told me. The AG's office is very interested in what your financial records have to say." Knox's jaw moved. A small motion, almost imperceptible. "This is harassment," he said. "This is criminal intimidation, and I will—" "Gerald." Dante said the name the way you set something down on a table. "Final. Without decoration." "The sheriff is 20 minutes away. The AG already has the filing. Whatever you are planning to accomplish tonight is over." His voice didn't rise. It never rose. "So you have 20 minutes to decide how this next part looks. That's what I'm offering you. 20 minutes to figure out how to stand on that driveway when the sheriff gets here and not make everything that comes next worse than it needs to be." Knox looked at him. He looked at Serena. She held his gaze. The uncertainty crossed his face again, and this time it stayed longer. She watched it. This man who had been the fixed point of her entire understanding of how power worked, the unmovable thing around which her childhood had organized itself in fear, watched him stand in the dark on the edge of his own property and calculate the shape of what was left. His two men stood with their hands loose and their eyes elsewhere. Reyes was on his phone. The night was very quiet. Knox straightened his jacket. It was a physical reflex, the gesture of a man who self-regulated through appearance, who had always found that looking correct was the first step toward being treated correctly. He looked at Serena one more time, and the look on his face was the most complex thing she had ever seen from him. Not the performance of concern, not the cold efficiency, not the uncertainty. Something beneath all three. Something that might, in a different man, in a different life, have been the beginning of something like shame, but only the beginning, and only might have been. He turned and walked back toward the house. His men followed. Serena let out a breath that had been somewhere in her chest for approximately her entire adult life. The sheriff's deputy arrived in 19 minutes. One car, one deputy, young, with the look of someone who had expected a domestic dispute and was recalibrating. Dante's people had redistributed themselves by then. Voss and Cabrera back in the lead vehicle, the third car pulled to the shoulder, everyone visibly still and non-threatening in the way of people who were very good at appearing non-threatening when the situation called for it. Reyes handled the deputy with the smooth efficiency of someone who had handled this category of interaction many times and knew that what law enforcement needed in ambiguous situations was paperwork and a clear narrative. He had paperwork. He had a very clear narrative, supported by a filing reference number from the Connecticut AG's office that the deputy could and did verify on his dashboard terminal. Knox came to the door of the house when the deputy's lights came up the drive. He stood on the front step in the porch light and spoke to the deputy for 4 minutes. Serena watched from the road. She could see his body language from here. The careful reasonableness, the measured gestures, the practiced performance of a man who was used to being believed. She had watched that performance her entire childhood and had spent her entire adulthood trying to explain to herself why it had always worked. The deputy looked between Knox and the road 3 times. He made a call on his radio. He made a second call. He spoke to Knox for another 2 minutes. Then he got back in his car and drove back down the drive. He stopped beside Reyes's window. Low conversation. Reyes nodded. The deputy nodded. The deputy looked at Serena through the windshield, directly, briefly, with the expression of someone filing something away. And then he pulled back onto the road and was gone. Reyes came back to where Dante and Serena were standing. "No grounds for arrest tonight," Reyes said, but the deputy called his captain, who has the AG filing on his desk. "Knox isn't going anywhere that isn't monitored." He looked at Serena. "You need to be somewhere that isn't here." "I know," she said. "We have a car for you. Delia Park. She's been notified. She's expecting you." Serena nodded. She looked at the house, the porch light, Knox's silhouette still visible through the front window, a dark shape behind glass. She turned away from it. But she didn't make it to the car. She was 3 steps from the rear door of the second vehicle when Reyes's phone went off. She heard his voice change, the specific register of someone receiving information they hadn't anticipated. The slight elevation in pace that Reyes almost never showed. "When?" he said. A pause. "How long ago?" Another pause. He looked at Dante. Dante read his face and felt something drop in his chest, the cold, specific drop of a man who has been in enough situations to know when the floor of one has just given way. "Tell me," he said. "The probate filing." Reyes said. The stay motion. He stopped, started again, which was unusual for Reyes, who was not a man who started sentences twice. The judge denied it. Dante looked at him. 20 minutes ago. Emergency session. Knox's attorney filed a counter motion 2 hours ago, before we even got here. A different judge. The original judge on the case recused herself last week. Knox's attorney filed a conflict motion, got her removed. The replacement was appointed 3 days ago. Reyes's voice was completely flat. The replacement denied the stay. Which means the conservatorship hearing proceeds in 10 days, Dante said. Which means it proceeds tomorrow, Reyes said. The counter-motion included an emergency acceleration request. Given that Knox claimed she was in a state of acute mental distress and had made contact with a known criminal organization, he stopped. The hearing is at 9 a.m., Hartford Probate Court. Dante was still for a moment. Then he turned and looked at the house. The light was still on in Knox's front window. He understood it now. The phone call Knox had made on the lawn. Not to the sheriff. Or not only to the sheriff. The sheriff had been theater. The call that mattered had been to his attorney, who had been positioned for exactly this contingency, who had a filing already prepared that needed only a signal to submit. Knox had been watching them move pieces across the board for 11 days, and he had been moving his own pieces underneath, in the dark, in the language of probate law and judicial appointments and countermotions filed in the specific 40-minute window when Dante's convoy was on the highway and Reyes's attention was on logistics. He knew we were coming, Dante said. Not to Reyes, not to anyone. Just saying it because the shape of it needed to be spoken. He's known for at least 3 days, Reyes said. Possibly longer. The judge replacement was filed before I pulled the financial records. Before I even started looking at trust documentation? Dante turned that over. Before Reyes started looking. Which meant Knox had known someone was looking before Reyes was the someone doing it. Which meant the leak wasn't in the looking. It was earlier. It was the approach. It was something closer to the beginning. He felt the thing that he very rarely let himself feel in operational contexts. The specific cold of being outmaneuvered. Of having moved with what he'd believed was sufficient speed, and having arrived to find that the ground had been prepared for his arrival in ways that converted his advantages into liabilities. He thought about Serena's phone call. He knows someone's been looking at the trust records. Knox hadn't known because of Reyes. Knox had known because he had a source inside the probate system that had flagged the inquiry. 17 years of positioning, board seats, scholarship endowments, consulting relationships with physicians and attorneys, and financial institutions. The same infrastructure Dante had read as public relations was also an intelligence network. Every relationship Knox had built and maintained and cultivated was a node in a system designed to alert him when something moved in his direction. Serena was standing beside the car. She had heard enough. He could see it in her face. Not the flinch, not the retreat, something harder than both. The expression of someone who has just watched the exit they identified close in front of them and is still deciding what to do about it. The hearing is tomorrow, she said. 9 a.m. Yes, Dante said. She looked at him. He's going to have everything lined up, she said. The psychiatric evaluation, the financial records, his version, the testimony. He's been preparing this for months, maybe years. She looked at the house. We have one night. We have one night, Dante confirmed. She was quiet for 3 seconds. What can you do in one night? He looked at her directly. He didn't soften it. I don't know yet. Reyes was already on the phone. What followed in the next 6 hours was not the kind of work that looked like anything from the outside. It looked like men in cars on phones. It looked like documents on tablet screens and names cross-referenced against databases and calls, made to people who picked up at midnight because they understood that the people calling them at midnight were the people who kept their own complicated situations workable. It was the machinery of a particular kind of power, not violence, not intimidation, the other kind, the kind built from 17 years of knowing where bodies were buried in the specific metaphorical sense, of having accumulated enough information about enough people in enough positions that leverage was always available for the right application. Dante worked the phone from the back of the car while Caruso drove them to a hotel 40 minutes from Hartford. Reyes worked from the front seat. Serena sat beside Dante and watched him work and didn't speak, which he registered as intelligence. She understood that the work needed the space it was taking up, and she gave it the space without being asked. The psychiatric evaluator's license suspension was real and documentable, and Reyes's contact at the state medical board could produce the formal record with a case number by 6 a.m. That was one piece. The replacement judge, Dante's contact in the Connecticut legal community, a defense attorney who had worked adjacent to Dante's organization for 9 years and owed him a careful favor, made 4 calls before 2 a.m. and came back with something useful. The replacement judge had a history, not a disqualifying history, nothing that would have prevented the appointment, but a history that included a personal friendship with a partner at the law firm that represented Knox's primary real estate holding company. It was a connection that Knox's attorney had very likely known about when they filed the recusal motion against the original judge, and it was the kind of connection that a skilled appellate attorney could frame as a conflict of interest worth examining. It wasn't enough to stop the hearing, but it was enough to make noise. The third piece came from Reyes at 2:47 in the morning, and it was the piece Dante hadn't anticipated. "The holding company," Reyes said, "the one that owns the Vermont facility, the psychiatric residence in the conservatorship filing. What about it?" "It's not just Knox." Reyes turned the tablet. "There are 3 other investors, silent partners. I've got names." Dante looked at the names. One of them he recognized immediately, a state senator from central Connecticut, 18 years in office, whose campaign finances had a particular relationship with Knox charitable organization that was currently under separate federal scrutiny for unrelated reasons. If that name gets attached to a facility designed to isolate a woman for the purpose of financial fraud, Dante said. "It ends his career in 48 hours, Reyes said. "And he knows it. Can we reach him tonight?" Reyes checked his watch. "It's 3 a.m. "Can we reach him?" Reyes picked up his phone. Serena was still awake at 4 in the morning. She was sitting in the chair by the window of the hotel room they'd given her. The room adjacent to Dante's, connecting door left ajar at his instruction, not in a way that felt invasive, in a way that felt like the door being open was its own kind of information. And she was looking at the parking lot below without seeing it, and thinking about 9 a.m. She was thinking about what it would mean to walk into a courtroom in 5 hours, underprepared, with documents assembled overnight by a Mafia Boss's network against a motion that had been engineered for months by a man who had spent 40 years learning how courtrooms worked. She was thinking about the psychiatric evaluation, the way it would be read into the record, the clinical language of incapacitation applied to her, the specific violence of having your interiority rewritten by someone else's paid expert. She knew what the evaluation said. Reyes had shown her a copy. Patient exhibits severe anxiety disorder consistent with inability to manage complex financial or legal decisions. Patient demonstrates paranoid ideation regarding family members providing care and oversight. Patient would benefit from supervised residential environment to ensure stability and appropriate management of inherited assets. She had read it twice. The second time she had set it down on the table and sat with it for 3 minutes, and not allowed herself to do anything dramatic with what she was feeling, which was the specific discipline of someone who had spent a long time not doing anything dramatic with what she was feeling. Then she had folded it in half and put it face down. The knock on the connecting door was quiet. She looked over. Dante was in the doorway, not entering, standing at the threshold, which she noticed, still in the same clothes. His jaw had the shadow of a very long day on it. He looked tired in the way of men who didn't let tiredness become an excuse, which made it more visible rather than less. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you." "I don't sleep much." "Neither do I," she said. He looked at her. Not the way he'd looked at her in the ballroom, not the cataloging attention of a man trying to understand something that didn't fit his existing categories. Something more direct than that. The look of someone who had spent 6 hours moving pieces across a board on her behalf and had arrived at a place where the pieces were where they were going to be, and the board was going to look the way it was going to look, and what was left was just the two of them, exhausted on opposite sides of a threshold at 4 in the morning. He came in, sat on the edge of the table near the window, not close, not performing distance either, just in the room. "The senator," he said. "We reached him." She looked at him. He's withdrawing his support for Knox's motion, quietly. He'll contact the judge through his attorney before 8 a.m. It won't stop the hearing, but it changes the arithmetic of what Knox can count on walking in there. She nodded slowly. What else? The evaluating physician. His license suspension is on record. We have the case number and the formal documentation. Your attorney? I don't have an attorney. You do now. Her name is Miriam Cross. She's based in Hartford. She's handled 3 conservatorship fraud cases in the last 4 years. She has won 2 of them, and the 3rd is still in appeals. He said it matter-of-factly. The way you reported a thing that had been arranged rather than a thing you were offering. She's reviewed the financial records. She's reviewed the psychiatric evaluation. She'll be at the courthouse at 8. Serena looked at him for a moment. You arranged all of that tonight, she said. Reyes arranged it. I made some calls. Who pays for it? Something crossed his face. Not offense, not quite amusement. Don't worry about that right now. I do worry about that, she said. I worry about exactly that. I've spent my whole life inside arrangements made by men who said, don't worry about it. He was quiet for a beat. Fair, he said. You pay for it. When the trust transfers and you have the money, you pay Miriam Cross her rate and whatever you think is right for the other work. He held her gaze. I'm not Knox. I'm not building credit. She studied him, the tiredness in his face, the set of his jaw, the hands resting loose on the table, the same hand she'd looked at in the ballroom, flat on the white tablecloth, relaxed in a room full of nervous people. Why? She said. He looked at her. Why any of this? She said. You don't know me. You saw me for 40 seconds at a party. Why did you... She stopped, looked at the window. Why does a man like you spend 11 days and however many resources on a man like me, he said. The way he said it wasn't defensive. It was just precise, turning the phrase over so she could look at what it contained. I don't mean it as, I know what you mean. He looked at the parking lot. My mother, he said. Just that. Left it there for a moment. There was a man like Knox, when I was young, before I was someone who could do anything about it. He looked back at her. I became someone who could do something about it, and then I had to find something to do something about. The room was very quiet. She understood that this was the most he was going to say about it. She also understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that it was enough. The hearing is in 5 hours, he said. I know. You should sleep. I know that too. He stood, moved toward the connecting door, stopped at the threshold. Serena. He said her name the way it was meant to be said. Not sweetheart, not the proprietary softness of a man who used names to remind you that he knew them. Just her name. Just the word. Tomorrow, in that courtroom, everything we have is good. It might be enough. She looked at him. Might, she said. Might, he confirmed. He didn't dress it up. She had already demonstrated that she knew the difference between the truth and a performance of the truth. And he had decided, at some point in the last 11 days, that she deserved the actual thing. He went back through the connecting door. She sat for another hour in the chair by the window, watching the parking lot go from dark to the first gray suggestion of morning, and she thought about the word might and what it felt like to walk into a room, knowing that might was the best you had. She had done it before. She had done it every day for 7 years in a house called Dunmore, with no one on the other side of any door. She had done it at 18 with a bus ticket and a scholarship letter and $40. She had done it every time she walked into a ballroom with a clipboard and made herself useful and invisible and competent, and tried very hard not to think about the fact that she had never, not once, believed she was allowed to take up the space she was actually standing in. She looked at her own hands in her lap. Still, not shaking. At 5:45, she got up and washed her face and sat back down and waited for 6 a.m. When Reyes knocked on her door with coffee and a pressed jacket Miriam Cross had sent from her office, and the morning came on hard and gray and cold the way New England mornings came on in the heavy months. And 9 a.m. was 3 hours away, and Gerald Knox was in a house called Dunmore, 2 miles north, getting ready in his own way for the same room. The Hartford Probate Court was a building she had never been in, but she had been in rooms that felt like it her entire life. She knew how to stand in them. What she didn't know what none of them could know, standing in the lobby of that hotel at 7:15 with the documents in order and Miriam Cross on the phone and Dante's car waiting at the curb, was what Knox had been doing in those 2 miles between them, in the hours before the hearing, in the specific dark of a man who had not yet shown everything he had. He was not finished. She understood that the way she understood weather. The question was what form it took when it... The form it took was a man in a gray suit standing on the courthouse steps at 8:47 in the morning, 13 minutes before the hearing was scheduled to begin, holding a manila envelope. Not Knox. Knox's attorney. A man named Pratt, mid-50s, silver-haired, with the particular grooming of someone who billed $400 an hour and needed you to be able to tell that from across a parking lot. He was standing at the top of the steps with the envelope held loosely at his side, and the expression of a man who had been given specific instructions about how this morning was supposed to go and was currently recalibrating those instructions against the reality of what he was looking at. What he was looking at was Miriam Cross. Miriam Cross was 52 years old and looked like someone's favorite aunt until she opened her mouth, at which point she looked like what she actually was, a woman who had spent 26 years in Connecticut courtrooms and had developed, through that experience, an almost supernatural capacity for reading the geometry of a situation from 30 yards away. She read Pratt from 30 yards away and said quietly to Serena beside her, "He has something new." "How do you know?" Serena said. "Because he's standing outside instead of inside." She adjusted the strap of her bag. "Men like Pratt don't wait outside. They wait where the judge can see them. He's out here because he wants to intercept us before we get through those doors." She started up the steps. "Let him." Dante was not on the steps. He was on the street below, leaning against the car, watching. He had understood without being asked that walking into a probate court with Dante Varelli was a visual that Pratt would use before the morning was an hour old, and he had made the calculation quickly and correctly and stayed on the street. Serena had looked back at him once, from the bottom of the steps, and he had given her a single nod, small, direct, and she had turned and gone up. Pratt came down 2 steps to meet them. "Ms. Cross? Ms. Vale." His voice was the voice of a man performing reasonableness with the specific intensity of someone who needed something. "I wonder if we might have a word before we go inside." "We're going inside in 11 minutes, Miriam said pleasantly. "You have 10. Something moved behind his eyes. He looked at Serena. The envelope shifted in his hand. "My client has authorized me to offer a settlement," he said. Miriam didn't blink. "We're listening." "Mr. Knox will withdraw the conservatorship motion in its entirety. He will also agree to a full accounting of the trust assets under independent audit, with any identified discrepancies to be resolved through a structured repayment schedule." Pratt paused. "In exchange, Ms. Vale agrees to a mutual non-disparagement clause covering all statements made to media, regulatory bodies, and law enforcement, and agrees not to pursue civil litigation arising from the management of the trust." The morning was cold. Traffic moved on the street below. Somewhere in the building behind them, a hearing room was being set up for 9 a.m. Serena looked at the envelope. "He wants me to stay quiet," she said. Not to Pratt, not quite to Miriam either, just to the air in front of her, where the shape of it needed to be. "The settlement is a full and final resolution," Pratt began. "He wants the money back without the consequences," Serena said. "He'll give me what he took because we can prove he took it, and he knows it, and he needs me to sign something that says I won't say so to anyone." Pratt's mouth closed. Miriam looked at Serena and waited. Serena looked at the envelope. She thought about the things she'd told herself at 4 a.m. in the chair by the hotel window, about rooms that felt like this, about standing in them. "No," she said. Pratt's face moved. "Ms. Vale, I want you to understand that a settlement of this nature—" "I understand exactly what it is," she said. "The answer is no." Miriam Cross looked at Pratt with an expression that was almost sympathetic. "You have 7 minutes," she said, "to get inside and figure out how you'd like to present your client's position to the judge, given that we'll be presenting ours." She moved past him up the steps. "Come on, Serena." Serena followed. At the bottom of the steps, she heard Dante's car door close. The hearing room was smaller than she'd expected, Wood paneling, institutional lighting, two long tables facing a raised bench, a gallery of perhaps 20 seats of which maybe a third were occupied. Clerks, a reporter from the Hartford Courant, who had received Reyes's filing the night before and was here in a professional rather than personal capacity, two individuals she didn't recognize who had the specific attentiveness of people who were present as witnesses to something. Knox was already seated at the table on the left. She had not seen him since the tree line, since the flashlight, since he had said don't move in the voice he only used when he had stopped performing. He was performing now. Gray suit, well pressed, hands folded on the table with the patience of a man who had done nothing wrong and was here to demonstrate that fact. He looked at her when she came through the door. Not at Miriam, not at the documents Miriam was arranging on their table, at her. The look was the old look. The concern, the patient authority. She sat down. She did not look away from him first. This was also new. He looked away. Judge Patricia Morrow came in at 9:02, late 50s, compact, with short gray hair, and the look of a woman who had been doing this job long enough that she had opinions about most of the attorneys who appeared before her and did not find it necessary to conceal those opinions. She was not the replacement judge. She was the original judge, the one Knox's attorney had filed to remove on conflict grounds, the one who had recused herself last week. Miriam had made 4 calls between 6 and 7 a.m. that Serena hadn't been present for. One of those calls, apparently, had produced a result. Pratt, coming through the door behind them, stopped when he saw the bench. Judge Morrow looked at him over her reading glasses with the expression of a woman who had expected this exact reaction and found it precisely as entertaining as she'd anticipated. "Mr. Pratt," she said, settling into her chair, "the conflict motion you filed last week was reviewed by the appellate court this morning. It was denied at 7:55 a.m. on the grounds that the alleged conflict, a shared membership on a library foundation board in 2019, does not meet the threshold for mandatory recusal under Connecticut judicial ethics guidelines." She set down her glasses. "Judge Hollenbeck has returned the matter to my docket. Do you have any procedural objections before we begin?" Pratt stood at the back of the room and did the math that was in front of him and did it fast, the way smart men did it, arriving at the answer clearly and without flinching. "No objection, Your Honor," he said. "Good," she said. "Sit down." What followed was 3 hours and 17 minutes of the most sustained, meticulous dismantling that Serena had ever witnessed. Miriam Cross was not theatrical. That was the thing Serena hadn't understood until she watched her work. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't make speeches. She submitted documents with the methodical patience of someone who understood that in this room, the truth was not a performance. It was an accumulation, piece by piece by piece, laid on top of each other until the weight of them was simply too much to argue against. The psychiatric evaluation first. The license suspension of the evaluating physician. Case number, documentation, formal record from the state medical board. Pratt objected. Miriam produced the board's own published disciplinary record. Judge Morrow admitted it. The trust financial records. 17 years of management fees, consulting charges, capital reallocations, each one individually defensible on its surface, each one slightly large, slightly frequent, slightly above market rate. But the pattern over 17 years, rendered in a spreadsheet that Reyes's financial contact had assembled between midnight and 4 a.m., was a picture that looked like one thing from any single data point and looked like something else entirely when you stood back far enough to see all of it. Pratt cross-examined Miriam's financial expert with the aggressive technical precision of someone trying to find a thread to pull. The expert, a forensic accountant from New Haven who had testified in 43 cases, answered each question with the specific calm of a person who had been cross-examined before and had learned that calm was more devastating than combativeness. Knox sat at his table and made notes on a legal pad and kept his face arranged in the patient authority he'd brought in with him. But by the end of the first hour, the notes he was making had become shorter, and by the end of the second hour, he had stopped making them. Serena sat beside Miriam and watched. There was a particular thing that happened when you watched the structure of someone's power being examined in daylight for the first time. Not collapsed, not yet, but examined. turned over. The way you turned over a piece of furniture to look at the underside and found that what looked solid from the front was held together with things that were never supposed to be seen. She had spent her life inside that structure. She had believed, with the bone-deep conviction of someone who had learned it before she had language to question it, that it was unmovable, that it was simply the shape of the world. It was not the shape of the world. It was the shape of what Gerald Knox had built. And it had been built by a person, which meant it could be taken apart by people. At 11:19, Judge Morrow called a 15-minute recess. In the corridor, Pratt found them. He didn't have the envelope anymore. He had a different look, the look of a man who had arrived at a position through logic rather than preference and was prepared to act on it regardless of how it felt. "My client would like to revise the settlement offer," he said. "We declined the first one," Miriam said. "The revision is substantial." He looked at Serena. "Full trust restitution. No structured repayment schedule, immediate transfer of all identified discrepancies, plus an additional sum for damages." He named a number. "No non-disparagement clause. You retain the right to cooperate with any regulatory or law enforcement investigation." Miriam looked at Serena. Serena looked at Pratt. "He drops the conservatorship motion. The motion will be withdrawn before we go back in. And he has no further claim on any asset, financial instrument, or legal interest connected to my mother's family trust or my estate." "Agreed." She was quiet for a moment. In the hearing room behind the closed door, she could hear the muffled sounds of clerks moving paper, of the ordinary machinery of a courthouse going about its business. Down the corridor, through a tall window, the morning had turned. The gray had broken open, and there was actual sunlight coming through. The specific thin gold of late autumn light that didn't warm you but reminded you that warm was possible. She thought about Marisol, about a brass key and 16 steps through a dark cellar and a wet lawn at night, and a tree line she'd walked into without knowing what was on the other side. "One more thing," she said. Pratt waited. "The Vermont facility. The psychiatric residence." She held his gaze. "I want it investigated. Not by me, by the state. Whatever cooperation your client needs to provide to the Department of Public Health about the other individuals currently resident there, he provides it. Fully. Without legal obstruction." Pratt's face moved. "That's outside the scope," he began. "That's my condition," she said. "Take it back to him." Pratt looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and went back toward the hearing room. Miriam Cross said nothing for 3 seconds. Then she said, "You know that provision has no teeth unless he agrees voluntarily." "I know," Serena said. "He might not agree." "Then we go back in," Serena said, "and we finish it." Miriam looked at her with the expression of a woman who had spent 26 years watching people decide what they were made of in courthouse corridors. "Okay," she said simply. Pratt came back in 4 minutes. "He agrees," he said. The motion was withdrawn at 11:41 a.m. Judge Morrow accepted the withdrawal with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had seen enough of this case to have opinions she was professionally obligated not to express, and she expressed them anyway through the specific economy of her language. The way she said, "The court notes the timing of this withdrawal," and let the note sit there in the record for anyone who wanted to find it later. Knox stood when it was over. He straightened his jacket, the same reflex she'd watched on the dark lawn, the physical self-regulation of a man whose identity was constructed in how he appeared. And he looked at Serena across the room with the look that had no performance left in it. She waited. He crossed toward the door, Pratt beside him. He passed within 6 feet of her table. He did not speak. At the door, he stopped. He looked back at her one time. She looked at him. What passed between them in that 3 seconds was not reconciliation, and it was not forgiveness, and it was not the kind of moment that resolved into something clean. It was the look of 2 people who had occupied the same house during years that could not be undone, looking at the fact of each other one last time before the legal and financial and regulatory machinery that had been set in motion continued grinding in the direction it was going to grind, regardless of either of them. He left. The door closed. Serena sat in the chair for a moment after everyone else had begun moving, clerks collecting papers, the current reporter closing his notebook, Miriam stacking documents with the practiced speed of someone who had another hearing at 2. She sat and breathed and let the room be what it was. Fluorescent lit, wood-paneled, ordinary. A room where things happened to people every day, and then the next day more things happened, and the room continued not caring. She was 28 years old. The trust would transfer within 30 days under the settlement terms. The AG's investigation was open and would proceed on its own timeline, independent of anything she did or didn't do. The Vermont facility. She didn't know what would come of that provision. Pratt had agreed to it, which meant Knox had agreed to it, which meant there was something there he needed to stay ahead of. She would follow it. She would follow it for as long as it needed following. But that was later. Right now, she sat in the chair and breathed. Miriam put a hand briefly on her shoulder, just for a second. The contact of someone who understood what had just happened and knew that what it required wasn't words. And then she was gone too, into the corridor, onto the next thing. Serena sat alone in the room for another minute. Then she stood up, picked up her jacket from the back of the chair, and walked to the door. Dante was on the courthouse steps. He had moved from the car at some point, she didn't know when, she hadn't been watching, and was standing near the top of the steps with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the street below with the distant attention of someone whose mind was doing several things at once. When she came through the door, he turned and looked at her and read her face the way he read rooms, and something in his own face settled. "It's done," she said. "I know." Reyes got the withdrawal notice. He looked at her directly. "All of it?" "All of it." She stopped beside him. The sun was on the steps, thin and cold and present. "The Vermont facility." He agreed to cooperate with the state investigation. Dante raised an eyebrow slightly. "That wasn't in the plan." "No," she said. "It was mine." He looked at her. The way he looked at her was different from any of the ways he had looked at her before. Not the ballroom look, the cataloging, the puzzle of her reaction to a word. Not the operational look of the convoy and the tree line. Not the 4 a.m. look of a tired man on a threshold being honest about might. This was simpler than all of those. He was just looking at her. "Pratt agreed," she said. "Knox agreed," he corrected. "Pratt is just the mouth." "Knox agreed," she said, "which means he's more afraid of that facility than he's letting on." Dante nodded slowly. "There are other people in there." "Yes." "That's going to take time to unwrap." "I know." She looked at the street. "I have time." They stood on the steps for a moment in the way of people who had been moving very fast toward a fixed point and had arrived at it and were now adjusting to the experience of stillness. "What happens now?" she said. Not anxiously, just asking. "For Knox, the AG's office, the financial fraud case, the probate record. It moves slowly, but it moves." He paused. "He won't come at you again directly. The exposure is too high." "I know," she said. "That's not what I meant." He looked at her. She looked at him. She had spent her life learning to say nothing when she meant something. Learning to make herself not visible, not present, not a target. Learning that the cost of being seen was always higher than the cost of disappearing. She was 28 years old, and she had built her entire professional and personal life on the specific discipline of not taking up space. She was tired of it. "I don't know what to do with someone who did what you did," she said. "I don't have a category for it." "I'm not asking you to categorize it," he said. "I know." She looked at the street, at the ordinary city going about its ordinary Wednesday. "But I'm going to need time to figure out, I need to figure out who I am when I'm not managing around Gerald Knox. I've been doing that since I was 11 years old. I don't actually know what I do when I'm not doing that." "That sounds like a reasonable thing to take time for," he said. "It might take a while." "I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him when he said it. The directness of it. Not a performance. Dante Varelli was not a man who performed things he didn't mean, which was one of the many ways he was different from every other powerful man she had encountered. He said things because they were true. He said them in the fewest words necessary. And then he waited. She looked at his face, the jaw, the tiredness in it, the dark eyes that had been looking at her since a ballroom 2 months ago when she'd spilled a drink and flinched at a word and something in him had moved, and she thought about the thing he'd said at 4 a.m. "My mother." There was a man like Knox. Before I was someone who could do something about it. She understood something. He had not saved her. He had given her the conditions under which she could save herself. There was a difference. It was an important difference. It was possibly the most important difference she had ever had occasion to notice. The compliment, she said. He looked at her. At the ballroom. A woman that beautiful shouldn't look so terrified. She said it evenly, not performing the memory of it, not performing the reaction she'd had to it, just saying it. I've been thinking about why that one hit the way it did. Out of everything. She paused. With him, it was always the compliment first, before anything else. The compliment was the signal. Beautiful meant he'd noticed. And when he noticed, what came next was never... She stopped, chose words. It was never good. Dante was very still. So when you said it, she said, my body heard the signal before my mind could catch up. She looked at him directly. It wasn't about you. I need you to know that. I know, he said quietly. But also, she said, and paused, and let the pause be the size it needed to be. You were right about the terrified part. She looked at the street again. I was. I had been, for a very long time. She breathed in, out. I'm working on that. I know, he said again. The sun moved. The shadow of the building shifted on the steps, the light changing in the small, incremental way of late mornings, the world continuing its ordinary rotations entirely indifferent to the specific weight of what had just been resolved on these steps. Reyes appeared at the bottom of the stairs with the keys in his hand and the look of a man who understood that this was not a moment that required him to hurry anyone. Whenever you're ready, he said, to both of them. Serena looked at the city. She thought about her apartment, the plants that needed watering. She'd been gone 3 days and Delia had a key and had almost certainly watered them already, because that was who Delia was. She thought about her calendar, the events she'd had to cancel, the emails she hadn't answered. She thought about the professional reality of having disappeared for 3 days and the very practical work of explaining it in ways that didn't require explaining the parts that weren't anyone's business. She thought about all of that and found that it was manageable, that it was, in fact, the specific kind of ordinary problem that she was very good at solving. She picked up her jacket and put it on. I want to stop somewhere first, she said. Dante looked at her. Marisol, she said, the woman who gave me the key. She's still at Dunmore. She paused. I don't want her to find out what happened from Knox. Dante nodded once. We'll go. They went. The drive took 40 minutes through the kind of Connecticut countryside that looked exactly like what it was. Old money and old trees and the specific silence of places that had been owned by the same families for so long that the landscape itself had taken on the quality of something proprietary. She watched it through the window without the feeling she'd always had driving these roads, the tightness in the chest, the particular dread of approach. The gate at Dunmore was open. The property was quiet. Knox's car was gone. Pratt had driven him back, presumably, or he had his own arrangement. The house sat in the thin November sun looking exactly like what it was. Old, large, expensive, and entirely empty of the thing that had made it frightening. It was just a house. She hadn't known it was possible for it to be just a house. Marisol answered the back door within seconds of the knock, which meant she'd been watching from the window. She looked at Serena, at the jacket, the courthouse look of her, the fact of her standing on the back step in the daylight unharmed. And the expression on her face was not dramatic. It was small and private and went across her features like a hand smoothing something wrinkled. It went okay? Marisol said. It went okay, Serena said. Marisol nodded, looked past her at Dante, who had stayed back, near the car, giving the step its space. You're leaving, Marisol said. Yes. Good. She said it simply. You should have left years ago. I know. They stood in the doorway for a moment in the comfortable silence of people who had never been able to speak freely to each other and were now, at the end of it, finding that they mostly already knew what they would have said. What will you do? Serena asked. Now that, I'll manage, Marisol said. I always have. She looked at Serena steadily. You going to be all right? Yes, Serena said. It was the first time in her life she had said that word and felt it was accurate. Marisol reached out and touched her hand, briefly, once the way you touch something you were glad existed. And then she stepped back inside and the door closed quietly. Serena stood on the step for a moment. Behind her, the property was still. The trees that bordered the east lawn were bare now in the November cold, the branches clean and dark against the sky. She looked at them and remembered the dark of them on the night she'd crossed that lawn, the way the tree line had looked like a wall and turned out to be the way through. She walked back to the car. Mick. 6 months later, the doors of the Serena Vale Foundation opened on a Tuesday morning in April, in a building in Bridgeport that had been a warehouse and was now something else. Wide windows, clean walls, the particular smell of a new space that hadn't yet taken on the character of the people who would fill it, but would. The foundation's work was not complicated to describe. It helped people. People who had spent years inside structures that were designed to keep them there, financial structures, legal structures, domestic structures, and had gotten out, or were trying to get out, and needed the specific combination of legal counsel, financial literacy, and time that made getting out permanent rather than temporary. The opening was a small event. That had been Serena's choice. She'd coordinated enough large events to know that large events were theater, and this was not theater. This was work. There were 40 people in the room. Miriam Cross, Delia Park, who had cried in the car on the way over and then fixed her makeup with the brisk efficiency of someone who was not going to let that be the story of the morning. 2 women who had been at the Vermont facility and were now, 6 months into the AG's investigation, beginning to have the space and support to figure out what came next for them. Representatives from the State Attorney General's office. A reporter from the Courant who had followed the Knox story from the courthouse corridor and was here because this was the next chapter of it. And Marisol, who had driven herself from Hartford and was standing near the back with a cup of coffee and the specific expression of someone who had come to see something they had waited a long time to see and had gotten exactly what they came for. Serena stood at the front of the room and looked at the people in it. She thought about the ballroom at the Alderton Grand, the chandeliers, the string quartet, the white tablecloth and the broken glass, and the specific way silence moved outward through a room when something unexpected happened in it. She thought about the color leaving her face, the 2 steps backward, the body's own logic preceding the mind's, the way it always had. She thought about what it cost to unlearn a thing that had been built into you at 11 years old. The answer was a lot. More than a courthouse hearing, more than a signed settlement, more than the transfer of a trust fund, however significant. It was a daily thing still. It was a thing she did in small increments, in ordinary moments. The moment she received a compliment and noticed the old reflex and chose not to go with it. The moment she disagreed with someone and didn't spend 3 days second-guessing the disagreement. The moment she looked at something she'd made and let herself think it was good. Small moments. Unremarkable from the outside. Enormous from the inside. She spoke for 7 minutes. She hadn't written it down. She'd found in the past 6 months that the things worth saying were the things she already knew well enough not to need notes for. She said, "This work is slow." She said, "The legal system is a tool, and like all tools, it works better for some people than others. And part of what this foundation does is try to correct that imbalance in whatever small ways are available." She said, "Surviving something is not the same as being finished with it. And this space is for people who have survived and are now doing the longer, quieter work of figuring out what comes next." She said, "I know what that work feels like, and I know it's possible." She didn't say anything that wasn't true. The room applauded. She stood in it, in the sound of it, in the specific sensation of 40 people's attention on her, the thing that had terrified her in every room she'd ever stood in. And she did not flinch. She noticed that she did not flinch. She let the noticing be what it was. Afterward, when the room had begun to disperse into the smaller conversations that followed these things, she found herself near the window, the wide new ones, looking out at the April street, the trees coming back into leaf, the ordinary Bridgeport afternoon going about its business. Delia appeared beside her with 2 cups of coffee and handed one over without speaking, which was why Delia was who she was. They stood for a moment. "You did good," Delia said. "We did good," Serena said. Delia made a sound that was the sound of someone accepting a correction they'd expected. Across the room, near the door, Dante Varelli stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and no bodyguards and no particular performance of anything. He had come in quietly, late enough that the event was already underway, and had stood near the back with the specific stillness of a man who was here to witness something rather than be witnessed. He had not interrupted. He had not made his presence a thing that needed to be managed. He looked at her when she looked at him. The expression on his face was the one she'd been learning over 6 months to read accurately. It wasn't easy. Dante's face was not built for legibility by design and by practice, but she'd learned the small things. The way the line of his jaw changed when he was satisfied versus when he was just quiet. The way his eyes did something different when he was actually present in a moment versus when he was managing one. He was present. She held up her coffee cup slightly. Not a toast, not a performance, just an acknowledgement. A small flag in the air between them. He nodded. She turned back to the window. Outside, the April light was doing what April light did. Provisional, generous, arriving after a long time away and offering itself without demanding credit for the return. She drank her coffee. She thought about nothing in particular for a moment, which was still, after 6 months, a thing she had to practice. The capacity to be in a moment without managing it, to let the room be the room and the light be the light and herself be herself without the constant surveillance of someone waiting for the signal that preceded pain. It was getting easier. Not easy. Getting easier. There was a distance between those two things that she had stopped trying to collapse. She heard him come to stand beside her, felt the specific gravity of his presence, that quality she'd noticed the first night, the stillness that was not absence but mass. He stood beside her and looked at the same window. "The 2 women," he said quietly, "from the facility. Are they connected to the AG case?" "Their testimony is part of it," she said. "Miriam is handling the legal coordination." She paused. "It's going to take another year at least before Knox faces anything formal." "I know." "He might not," she said. "Face something formal. Men like him often don't." "I know that too." She looked at him. "Does that bother you?" He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, and no. He looked at the street. He's finished in this state. The financial case, even if it doesn't reach criminal charges, has destroyed everything he spent 40 years building. The reputation, the board seats, the philanthropy. All of it is what the story is now. A pause. "That's not nothing." "No," she said, "it's not nothing." They stood there. The room behind them moved and spoke and did the things rooms did after events. The gathering of coats, the exchange of cards, the particular warm noise of people who had come together for a purpose, beginning the process of dispersing back into their separate lives. Marisol found them at the window before she left. She stood beside Serena and looked at the street and said nothing for a moment, and Serena didn't fill the silence, and Dante didn't either, and the 3 of them stood in the April light in a room that smelled of new paint and coffee and the beginnings of a thing that hadn't fully become what it was going to be yet. "You know what I thought about?" Marisol said finally. "When I heard you speak today." "What?" Serena said. "The sandwiches." She said it simply, matter of fact. "All those years, I left the sandwiches. I told myself it was enough, that I was doing something." She looked at the street. "It wasn't enough. I know that." "It kept me going," Serena said. "That's not the same thing as enough." "No," Serena said. "But it was what was possible then, and you did it. And then when something more was possible, you did that too." She looked at Marisol. "That's the whole thing, isn't it? You do what's possible, and then you try to make more things possible." Marisol looked at her. Something in the older woman's face released. A tension that had been there so long it had become part of the architecture, visible only in its absence. She nodded once. She put on her coat. She said goodbye. She left. Dante watched her go. "She'll be okay," Serena said. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." The room was mostly empty now. The current reporter was still at the far end, writing something in a notebook with the absorbed concentration of someone trying to get a thing exactly right. Miriam was at the door talking to one of the AG representatives with the clipped efficiency of someone managing 3 simultaneous professional threads. Delia had disappeared, which meant she was in the kitchen doing something practical, which was the form her love always took. Serena and Dante stood at the window. "I want to tell you something," she said. He waited. "In the ballroom, when you said it." She looked at him. It was the first time in my life anyone had said that to me and meant only that. She paused. "I couldn't hear it then. I didn't have I was missing whatever part of you that lets a thing land the way it's meant to." She looked at the window. "I have it now. More of it than I did." He was quiet. "So I'm telling you," she said, "so you know that it landed, eventually." He looked at her for a long moment. "Okay," he said. "Quiet. Just that." She nodded. Outside, the April afternoon continued being what it was, ordinary and unhurried and full of the small specific sounds of a city going about the ordinary business of being alive. Traffic. Someone's radio. The thin warmth of a sun that was staying longer each day than it had the day before, gaining ground incrementally, the way most things worth having were gained. She turned from the window. She had work to do. She went to do it.